We're going to start our program today with three amazing speakers. We have two of our regional Federal Reserve Bank presidents, Tom Barkin of Richmond and Austan Goolsbee of Chicago. They are going to be joining us live in just a second from the screen. And in person, we have Deval Patrick, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment. I just want to note that we're very happy to be collaborating with the Chicago and Richmond Fed banks, along with the Atlanta and Philadelphia banks, on a forthcoming project to highlight innovative approaches to workforce training. And you'll hear more from us on that in early 2025, so stay tuned for that. So now, let me just take a moment to introduce our moderator for our opening panel, Deval Patrick. All of the bios are included in your program, so we're just going to skip to highlights here. But Deval is a business executive, impact investor, political and civil rights advocate, and, as everyone knows, former governor of Massachusetts. The tidbit that's not in your program, because it's relatively new, he is currently a senior advisor to the Vistria Group, a private investment firm that invests in both financial return and for positive social impact, and he's a professor of practice of public leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School. As governor from 2007 to 2015, he expanded affordable health care to more than 98% of the state's residents. He launched innovative initiatives to stimulate clean energy and biotech investments, and he steered the state to a 25-year high in employment. He then founded the Double Impact Fund at Bain Capital, which was the first investment fund of a major impact investing fund of a major U.S. investment firm. Most importantly for us, we're very proud to call him a member of the Social Finance Board of Directors. So with that, let me welcome Deval Patrick to the stage, and we will welcome Presidents Barkin and Goolsbee to the screen. Thank you.
Karen, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. Congratulations, Tracy, and everybody at Social Impact. It's a great joy to join you today in the company of our first guests. Tom Barkin has been president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond since 2018. He serves as a voting member on the Fed's Open Market Committee and is responsible for bank supervision and the Fed's technology organization. Before that, he was a senior partner at McKinsey and CFO, where he oversaw the firm's offices throughout the South. Austan Goolsbee is the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago and has been since 2023. Like President Barkin, he also serves on the Federal Open Market Committee. He was formerly the Robert P. Gwynn Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business and has served as chairman of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors and held a whole variety of advisory roles, including on education, economic policy, and digital technology. And warm welcome to you both. Thanks for joining today. So now, the Federal Reserve has this dual mandate to maximize employment and minimize inflation. And while I gather there is no fixed formula, the idea seems to be that unemployment and inflation rates have to be in some sort of equipoise. One of the tools you use to achieve that equipoise is interest rates, which the Fed has raised, harumph, some 11 times in 2022 and 2023 and hasn't changed since last July. The Fed's target inflation rate, I think, is 2%. And just this morning, we learned that inflation ticked up in March by 0.4% and 3.5% year over year. Now, it's possible to imagine, this is all by way of setup, continuing pressure on, from housing inflation in particular, since that has remained stubbornly high as demand in many markets far exceeds supply. Meanwhile, unemployment has been at historic lows, now around 3.8%, as you know. And here again, it's possible to imagine that the sort of downward pressure on unemployment rates will continue given the stubborn skills gap that exists. So many Americans not prepared enough for the many good, high-paying jobs that there are and seem will continue to be. So just how is the Fed going to get to equipoise? Are we going to have a soft landing after all? Who wants to go first?
Well, I'm happy to start. And thank you, Governor, for your questions. And Tracy and Karen, congratulations on the launch today. Of course, it's conceivable we're going to get to a soft landing. The numbers in a big picture have been great. Inflation year over year, PCE, which is our preferred metric, is 2.5%. And that's come down a long way at the same time as the economy stayed healthy, with GDP growth at a little over 3% and unemployment, as you say, below 4%. And I think, speaking for myself, if you had given me any of those numbers a year ago, I would have just taken them. So I think we're making a lot of progress. But we need to be humble about how easy it is to get there. One of the things about the phrase soft landing is it kind of implies everything happens easily and there's never any pain. And I just say there are two risks to it. One is the soft and one is the landing. On the soft part, anyone who's been in business for the last 30 years knows that most upturns don't end softly, they end roughly. And not because of the Fed, but because of 9/11 and the dot-com crash or Lehman Brothers or the pandemic. And so you've just always got to be humble about predicting it's going to be too soft when you know what history looks like. And then we do have this challenge on landing inflation. And today's numbers, as you suggest, are part of the story that suggests that having had the experience of raising prices, businesses are probably just a little bit slow to come back to where they were before pandemic. It may just take some time.
Okay, Austin?
Well, I would say Tom is one of my best friends on the committee, and you probably can't tell from the audience how hard it is for him to say that he thinks we need to remain humble when as a Fed and addressing prices. Look, I think if you take a step back, Governor, a lot of the things you said characterize normal times, which is equipoise. I like that you used equipoise in a sentence, that there's some balance between the employment side of the mandate and the price stability side of the mandate. But things were really strange going into and through COVID, and they look really strange coming out of COVID. And if you looked at 2023, which is now in the book, so we can't jinx it, what happened in 2023 was supposed to be impossible, was stated to be impossible by a lot of very smart economists, which is to say, inflation came down a lot and there wasn't a recession when that happened. That had basically never happened before, not only in the United States, but it's by central banks around the world. I started calling that the golden path, the mother of all soft landings. I think it's a deeper and more difficult question as we go into 24. Can we continue that, what we saw last year? And these first 3 months of this year, they're definitely bumpy. I mean, I still think that we have a little mileage to go, but we're getting to the point where there are going to be more trade-offs than there were last year when there weren't as many.
So I want to ask you about the beverage curve, and I'm trying to make it sound like I know what I'm talking about. But this is the historic measure or customary measure that measures the mismatch between jobs and workers, and tells us that job vacancies rise as unemployment falls and vice versa. That's not happening. So what is it? Does the beverage curve serve us or serve you as economists in evaluating what's happening right now? Does it tell us anything?
Oh man, you're going to take us right into the weeds. Look, we can go as far as you want. As you know, economists have a curve and a formula for everything. So we got a beverage curve, which is a guy named Beveridge. It has nothing to do with beverages. The beverage curve is about unemployment and vacancies. And it's the beverage curve thinking is why economists will a lot of times use as kind of a rule of thumb, how tight is the labor market? They'll take the ratio of unemployed workers to vacant jobs. By measures like that, during the pandemic, that ratio, the otherwise vacancies to unemployment, got up to levels that we had never seen in the data before. And that's why a lot of people said, wow, this is the hottest labor market that on record. Nobody's seen anything like it. There's another curve, the Phillips curve, which is about a trade-off between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. Mm-hmm. The thing is, no matter what curve, no matter what formula, just remember they're rooted in the historical data. So the 2023 year is exactly what I was just saying, that it doesn't look like anything that we have seen in modern history. Mm-hmm. And that's true on the beverage curve, where you've seen vacancies coming down without unemployment going up. So we're not moving along a curve. Mm-hmm. And you saw inflation come down without the unemployment rate going up. So I still just think it feeds it. The beverage curve is a piece of information that's important. It's useful. It connotes something about how good is the matching that takes place in the economy between employers and the unemployed. And the rule of thumb is that the unemployment rate goes up like a rocket and down like a feather, mm-hmm. because it's a lot easier to destroy a job match than it is to create one. That they can fire you, but for you to go find an employer takes a lot of search. And that's kind of one of the ideas behind the beverage curve. And that was thrown for a loop in the pandemic, as everyone knows, because there was a lot of unemployment that wasn't of the normal variety, that people could come back to the jobs that they had before.
So, Tom, you jump in on the beverage curve, and then I want to ask you a question about housing supply and demand and how it relates here, but go ahead.
Just on the beverage curve, just to throw in, I was in Hayward County, North Carolina. It's about an hour and a half due west of Asheville in the Appalachian Mountains, 16,000 people in the workforce. The biggest employer there, a paper company, closed down and laid off 1,100 people. So they laid off 1,100 people in a place where the workforce is 16,000 people. A year later, the unemployment rate is 2.9%. Why is that? That's not how it's supposed to happen. The beverage curve would say that's not how it happens. But there were so many vacant manufacturing jobs within a 45-mile radius that they all got filled. So we were in a world where we were so short workers that we just had vacancies everywhere. And so whatever, and there have been layoffs in the labor market, but the people who get laid off are just getting jobs much quicker than they had before because of all these excess vacancies. So that's what's different this time. And I think it's just
That's really good news. In a lot of places, the housing supply is a constraint on the ability of employers to fill those jobs. And Tom, you talked about made the point that labor supply in any given market is affected by the availability of affordable housing. And I just wonder how, if at all, can the Fed help address that challenge?
Well, just to support what you said to start, I'm in Shepherdstown, West Virginia today, and it's a place on I-81. There's a lot of jobs being added, and there's no place for people to live. Mm-hmm. And so when you talk to employers, either they've got people driving an hour to get to work, or they're saying, I just can't find workers. And that's a challenge for the employers. It's a huge challenge for the workers, obviously, who want to get into these houses. And the speech I gave, which I think you're referring to, says this is a math problem. The combination of construction costs and interest costs and land costs have led to the cost of housing being high. Mm-hmm. And the demand is so extraordinary that it's driving the prices up. And you just can't provide a set of housing in a lot of markets for people for workers at a price they can afford. What the Fed's lever is demand. When we raise rates, that does something to demand. But the answer here is about supply. So I don't think the Fed's the answer to every problem. I think the answer on the housing side is supply. And it's really noteworthy. If you drive up and down I-95 in my district, you'll see Maryland and Virginia, very little housing construction going on. You'll see in North and South Carolina a huge amount of construction going on. And that's cheap land, that's easier permitting, that's buildable land, flat, infrastructure. It's got sewer, water, electrical, broadband associated with it. And those houses are going up in places like Wilson, North Carolina, at $250,000 at prices that are a lot more affordable than you see in a lot of other places. And so,
but Tom,
I really
wouldn't a builder? I'm sorry.
Supply.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but wouldn't a builder say interest rates actually do matter to their investment?
Sure, and that's why I put that in the cost structure. But I'll also make the point that new home construction right now is actually pretty robust.
Mm-hmm.
I think it can get a lot more robust.
Yeah. Austin,
You got a little bit of complexity that's happened, and
Mhm.
it happens every time there's a rate tightening cycle. But the fact that this one went as fast as it did has made the problem I'm going to describe a little more, which is at any given moment, you got a stock of housing that already exists, and the people are mostly buying and selling the houses that already exist. So the flow rate of new construction is not that big a share of the total stock of housing.
Mhm.
And if you're in a place with a mortgage rate of 3%, and then if you try to refinance or move to a new house, you're going to have a mortgage rate of 8%. It's going to be on the margin, a lot of resistance to listing your house because you're going to say, hey, wait a second, I'm going to just wait. If I'm at all possible, I'm just going to wait until this blows over. Eventually, it's going to sort out. People have to move for jobs, people move, they retire, whatever. But we're in this weird moment where the supply of existing housing being put on the market kind of went down, and it went down so much that I think it actually stimulated demand for construction, for new construction, even though the interest rate going up would normally suppress new construction.
That's what
There
I
was
was
just
getting
so much demand for housing that they
at.
built more.
Okay, okay. So is the some relief from housing inflation, if I can call that, is that just something we have to wait for because people retire and they move or they move for jobs?
Probably.
Okay.
And look, the thing to remember also
You got to
is,
say something more hopeful than that.
well, the thing to remember is that the relative price of different things in the economy, this is not new that the relative price of housing is going up. So if you look over the last 20 years, we had about 2% inflation as according to our target. But that wasn't because everything had 2% inflation at the same rate.
Mhm.
Goods had minus 1% inflation for a long time. Services, not including housing, were about 2.5%. And housing was 3.5% inflation for a long period of time. So the relative price of buying TVs versus housing has been housing getting more and more expensive for many decades. It's gotten worse in this period right now because the housing payments are higher and we haven't had the supply, but it's part of a longer trend.
Tom,
There's
one
a
of the
secular, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to ask one of the I want to be mindful of time, but I want you to make your point. Please go ahead.
I was going to say there's a secular shift too in how much people care about housing. If you spend full time at home, or you spend 4 or 5 days a week at home when you used to spend 2 or 3, you're just going to care about your house a lot more. And so people are willing to spend much more on their house. And some of that is being financed because they're spending less money on transit or parking or gasoline.
Okay. Okay. The Fed in Richmond has focused on the challenges, the differences in the challenges facing small towns and rural communities. In a recent speech, you said, quote, small towns are going to have to up their games on the attraction, development, and retention of talent. And I wanted to ask you, are there places where rural communities are getting it right that you see, that you'd be willing to, examples you want to give us, or are there approaches that you've seen are most effective in promoting economic growth and opportunity in small towns and rural areas?
Yeah, thanks. Our district is full of small towns. Small towns perform worse on employment metrics than the bigger cities by 10 or 12 points in terms of employment to population. And that's true across the country. We are seeing that work from home or work remote is a game changer in that you can live anywhere. But the challenge is it also opens up every small town to compete against every other small town. And so this notion of how you attract the people who might want to work there becomes a big deal. And you see lots of folks working on streetscapes and amenities and those sorts of things. The thing I think is really interesting is where people are working against the barriers to work. So Southwest Virginia, they've taken some of the CARES Act money and put it into a United Way sponsored and corporate endorsed childcare cooperative that's got some space in providing childcare to provide for all of the employees of all of these employers, so that you can bring more people into the workforce. Similarly, I mentioned North Carolina, Wilson, North Carolina. Transportation, you can't do public transit at scale in a small town. They've actually got an Uber kind of on-demand transportation that's helping bring people to work and try to address the transportation problem. And then I'll say we're very invested in community colleges. In fact, from an outcome standpoint, we've actually launched a community college survey which better measures the outcomes of what's happening in community colleges. It's not just those who get 2-year degrees, it's those who transfer to 4 years, those who get certificates, those who end up in meaningful employment, dual enrollment. And we're trying to leverage that to understand the best practices in terms of partnerships and making those work. And again, even this week, I was in Allegheny Community College, where they've done a great job working with the high schools to get people on track to high value careers that are in that market. And so they're retaining people in that marketplace. I think in a school system that has about 1,500 people, they've increased by over 150 in a year, the number of people going into those certificate tracks. We're at Blue Ridge, that has a partnership with P&G, here in Martinsburg, where they're actually got the actual P&G machines in the community college, so that they're trained on those machines so that they can go to work and be productive day one. There's a lot of very interesting partnerships being done to drive outcomes in those community colleges.
I love that. That's great. That's great. Austan, let me ask you about what Chairman Powell has said about the maximum level of employment goal for the Fed, where he talks about it being broad-based and inclusive. And he said it reflects our appreciation for the benefits of a strong market, particularly for many in low and moderate income communities. And I want to ask you, how does the Fed take account of the differences in labor market outcomes across different communities when thinking about how to achieve full employment?
Yeah, look, it's a critical issue. I should have said at the outset, and it gives great relief to my colleagues, I don't speak for Chair Powell. I don't speak for anybody else on the FOMC. We're supposed to always give that disclaimer. Mm-hmm. I think
that is
the integration of, and you can see it, Tom and the bank at Richmond has been one of the leaders of incorporating the kind of granular local information and information from different groups into the discussion at the FOMC. We have a beige book. It's called the beige book because in the old days before it was, when it was printed, it was beige. Now it's a PDF. So I don't know what you call it, but in that beige book, each bank goes and gathers information. It used to be primarily and predominantly just from businesses, but we have expanded that. So it's now community leaders and labor groups, and we get a lot of anecdotal plus information that does play a role. If you go back and look at the transcripts from the FOMC, the local conditions that each of the reserve banks sees is embodied in our decision making. And I would just highlight as well, just from an economist perspective, if you look at the more what the economists call the marginally attached to the labor force groups, which is to say groups that are hardest hit have the highest unemployment rates at any given time. Mm-hmm. They are a little bit the canary in the coal mine. They are a very good indicator of where you are in the business cycle, and they lead. What happens there often leads historically what is about to happen in the overall economy. So the fact that in the last 3 months you've seen the African American unemployment rate rising, even as overall unemployment rates have stayed around the same, is at least an indicator of caution that we want to pay attention to. So I think it comes in from a macro perspective too.
Interesting. Wow. Tom, how do you think about about that
Well,
goal.
I think one thing we learned in the last upturn is if you can keep a upturn going, and you can keep employers focused on how do I get the next person in the workforce, that the longer you can have that go, the better the outcomes are for those on the edge of the labor force. And by the same token, as Austan says, when things go south, those are the labor force are the first ones out. We've had unemployment under 4% now for 26 months in a row. That's the longest period since the 60s, believe it or not. And that's, I think, the objective is to see how long we can keep the labor market strong in the context of inflation under control.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm going to go a little bit off script, if that's all right. I know it'll give Karen and and others heartburn, but I think you guys will be okay, which is why I'm going to look at you and not them. When I was in office, the bottom had fallen out of the global economy. And I've talked to other governors who served at that time, and we think wistfully about the tools available now, CHIPS, the rescue plan, the infrastructure bill, that could be applied to create growth strategies targeted in the places where you have some influence. And I've been a little bit amazed that I hear so little about these sort of multi-tiered or multi-factor strategies for long-term growth around the country in smaller communities or statewide or regional. Are you aware of these? Do you see examples of these we should be looking to? Tom?
Sure. So I'd say one of the most interesting things to me about this episode is that normally when you raise interest rates, one of the segments that's hit first is construction, right? I mean, it's a very interest sensitive sector. You expect construction employment to drop. That has not been the case in time. And in fact, you see it in spades. People are still wildly short carpenters, plumbers, welders, electricians, and even supply chain materials, transformers, those sorts of things. And a huge part of that is the amount of investment that's being made in infrastructure. And at least I'll speak for my district. In my district, another piece would be AI and data center investment. But there is just a lot of construction still going on that absolutely has been funded by a number of the acts that you talked about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And from my perspective, the Fed, we're out of the fiscal policy business and the congressional long-term investment business. That's what they got to do. Mm-hmm. We have only a screwdriver, and we can tighten the screw and we can loosen the screw, and that's what we can do. And to the extent that those interest-sensitive sectors are also the most cyclically sensitive sectors, it makes sense. But as soon as you get into a period like what happened with COVID, where the thing that drove the business cycle was not a drop in construction and a drop in durable goods manufacturing, it was people not being able to go to the dentist and get their hair cut. Now the Fed is at a bit of a loss because, again, if all you have is a screwdriver and then you say, well, can you make me breakfast? You can't really make breakfast with a screwdriver. And the part of what we experienced in COVID and after that is kind of directly relevant to the Fed's operation is that separate from those long-term investments, we also saw fiscal policy respond faster than ever before and get the money out the door in a way that was relevant to the business cycle. Normally, we think of the Fed as being the first line of defense about stabilization because we meet every 6 weeks. And through the interest rate channel, we can move quicker than historically fiscal policy did. But this time you saw fiscal policy really get in the game in a relevant time frame.
Mm-hmm. I was remembering that I was working at Chemical Bank around the time the first ATM was installed. And that the predictions were that it would be the end of branch banking and it would have a profound impact on employment. I think there are more than twice as many branches today and 3 times the number of people working in banking services today than when that first ATM was put out. So Tom, I wanted to just come back to this partnership, because one of the things we talk about here and want to talk about here is how we get ready for the economy that's coming. How do we help people prepare? And the partnership you talked about with the community colleges, is that a way for us to think about, very targeted, for us to think about how to prepare for the AI revolution?
Well, I really believe that with the surplus of workers that we had because of the demographic boom in the 90s, a whole generation of businesses decided they could outsource their talent prep to universities. And banking is a great example. Chemical Bank had a great banking training program back in the day. It was one of the best jobs you could get out of any school you wanted to. And then in the 90s, most everybody blew up those training programs because there were so many bankers around, you didn't need to train new ones. And that happened in industry after industry. If you do think we have any risk of labor being short in the coming decade or two, if you do think the skill retraining requirements are going to be such that you need help, then I do think there are going to be partnerships between institutions and businesses to prepare the people for work. And it's not a gee whiz, crazy ass idea. That's just what we ought to be doing. But I do think those lines need to get closer together. And the good community colleges and the good employers are working very closely in that way now. I think there's a lot of those partnerships we can replicate.
Mm-hmm. We want to thank you both. You've been great to be so generous with your time, and we appreciate your service to the nation.
I'm sorry we couldn't be there in person, but I hope you guys have a great day.